We're joined by our chief foreign editor, Robert Parsons. Thank you, Rob. This letter, this warning by the US, some would say it's about time.
Yeah, I mean, people have been saying in the United States, critics of the administration's policy towards Israel, that it's not using or hasn't been using the levers at its disposal to put pressure, sufficient pressure, on the Israeli government. Well, now it has done it. I mean, it's saying 30 days, that takes us beyond the election. So some might suggest, cynics at least, that that's a bit of a cop-out as well. But this was intended, apparently, as a private letter. So perhaps that was not the case. It was intended as a letter from Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, to U.S Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, and another minister, to put pressure. It is the most direct pressure that the United States has put on the Israeli government since the start of the conflict. Take urgent action now, take urgent measures, put them in place now, and make sure that by 30 days from this moment, at least 350 trucks a day are getting into the Gaza Strip, because the situation, according to the United States, is becoming critical. And it backs that up with information coming from the United Nations, which says that over the last 2 weeks, something in the region of 12 trucks, just 12 trucks, has managed to get into the north of Gaza, an area where 400,000 people currently live, which is under constant bombardment by the Israelis. The amount of aid getting into the north of Gaza is less now than it was back in March and April, when the United Nations, the United States and others were saying to Israel, you have to do something about the situation now. You have to allow much more aid into the strip than it's currently getting in, because the situation is beyond critical. Israel promised then, 6 months ago, that it will deal with that situation. Today, 50% less humanitarian aid is getting into the Gaza Strip than then. That's why the United States has taken this measure now, intending to put pressure on Israel. And as you pointed out in the introduction, saying that there is legislation in place in the United States to stop the supply of military equipment to countries if they impede the supply of U.S. humanitarian aid into the country. That is the position as things stand. Israel has promised it will look into the situation and act accordingly.
And what about the fighting in northern Gaza in particular? I mean, especially after Israel had said that it had basically wiped out Hamas as a fighting force there.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a mantra from the Israeli authorities for several weeks now, that Hamas is crippled as a fighting force and cannot present the sort of threat that it did in the past to Israel. Yet, as you point out, this is not the first time that this has happened. Jabalia, which is the sort of epicenter of the current fighting in North Gaza, a refugee camp, has now been 3 times the scene of fierce fighting between Hamas and the Israeli Defense Forces, which suggests that whatever the Israelis are saying about Hamas as a spent force, it doesn't, for the moment at least, retain the capacity to continue to be a thorn in the Israeli side. The Israelis are saying that that the Hamas as an organization is effectively decapitated, apart from the survival of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, that most of the military leaders have been killed, the administrative leaders, that its armament levels are right down, that the number of its fighters are right down. But it can still put up some sort of opposition, which again raises the question about what the Israelis are actually trying to achieve in northern Gaza. And the suggestion of some is that the idea is not just to defeat Hamas, or even mainly to defeat Hamas, but to force the population of northern Gaza down to the south, to the Mawasi Strip on the Mediterranean coast, where most of the people of Gaza have now been forced to flee. Then an emptied northern Gaza could be repopulated by Israel at a later date. That certainly is the intention of part of the right wing of Israeli politics. Whether it's the position of the government of this, we don't really know.
And given all of this and the fighting in southern Lebanon, what then are the chances of a ceasefire deal, or a deal to get back the remaining hostages from Gaza?
Well, U.S Gallant, the defense minister I referred to a moment ago, the recipient of that letter from the United States, summed it up pretty well on Monday in a meeting with the families of the hostages when he said that it's off the agenda, at least for the moment. It is off the agenda. He told them that there is no end in sight. There's stagnation, he said. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that, but that's the reality. He's blamed it pretty much squarely on Hamas, who's saying that there's been a hardening of Hamas's position on the idea of negotiations and a ceasefire, which is probably true. Hamas at the moment is looking at what's going on elsewhere in the Middle East, notably obviously in southern Lebanon, but also the threat of Iran becoming engaged in the conflict and thinking, well, look, this is what we wanted right at the start. This is what Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, wanted right at the start of the conflict in Gaza, to suck in others into the conflict and make it a regional rather than a local conflict. Yahya Sinwar is looking at the situation now and seeing that he's closer to achieving that end than at any point since the start of the conflict. So little incentive for him, in other words, to negotiate. Gallant also said to the families, look, it's of course we're going to try to keep getting the hostages home. It's in the ABC of Judaism for us to want to do that. But I think many of the families will say, yeah, we've heard that from you before. There have been promises, but opportunities have also been missed.
Of course. Thank you very much for that analysis, Rob Parsons.